Welcome to the Times of Industry show. What a year we're having. I mean, who could have predicted some of these incredible events? A Washington government shutdown, Hong Kong riots, Bitcoin up threefold, gold at 6 years high, markets at all-time highs. I mean, exciting year and definitely many more things to come. And continuing on our journey of great new guests, Ole Bjerg is an associate professor out of Denmark. He is right now talking to us from Copenhagen, where he was a TEDx speaker with a talk that is titled, "Where Does Money Come From?" And, Ole, first of all, how are you?
I'm fine. Just came back from vacation, so I'm fresh.
Okay, that's right. When I grew up, that question really fascinated me. Where does money come from? But my dad used to say, look, you can eliminate trees. It doesn't come from trees, but that's the extent of what he knew. Money doesn't grow on trees, but he didn't know where it comes from. And funny enough, I am right now in Florence, Italy, which is an hour away from Siena, where the world's oldest bank, and it's still in existence. So money comes from here, I can tell you that, but not really. So we are here to talk about the more in-depth of where does money come from, and for people to understand this. In your TEDx talk, one of the most inspiring lessons was that we should all familiarize ourselves with this topic. If you had access to a room with all the prime ministers or presidents, leaders of countries, of all 205, 206 countries, etc., all the sovereign countries, how would you go about adding knowledge, adding curriculum about money? What would you teach people if you could have your way? Because it's such a misunderstood topic.
I think the first thing you need to do with money is you need to demystify it, because the whole field of economics has a tendency to sort of pretend that it's extremely complicated and you need very special knowledge in order to understand it, which to some extent is true if you want to know it in depth and so forth. But there's also some things in the economy which are quite basic that everyone can learn, just like we can learn whatever ordinary topics we have in school. So you can teach this to children. It's not that complicated. And I think one of the things that now I teach it to university students, and I think one of the tricks or one of the difficulties of teaching students where money comes from and how it works, it's not so much to explain how the existing system works. It's more to sort of unlearn all the things that they've already heard, which tend to be sort of misleading. So if you start early, you don't have to de-learn anything. You can start with more or less a blank slate and then, build it there. One of the things that tends to confuse us is that we tend to compare money to like all kinds of other assets, which leads us to the conclusion that it's a scarce resource. And the idea that we can create it out of nothing is it goes against our basic understanding of the economy, where no other values can be created out of nothing, but money can. That's not to say that we should just do it, excessively, but to understand how something that has value can come out of nothing, that really boggles the mind, because we're used to thinking of it differently.
That's interesting. And let me follow up on that. So obviously when you say money, you mean currency, because that is what is being created, or credit, or government credit, or banking credit.
Yeah.
When it's created, it is a credit. Somebody is credited, the other person is debited.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, it is unique compared to house.
It is indeed, yeah. Of course, one of the things that you get into, one of the things that sort of standard economists will sometimes say, if you pose this question to them, they will start by talking about, we can't really say anything about that because there's so many things that can be money. And then they start talking about government bonds. Well, they can also be money, and gold can be money, and so forth. And I like to first of all, we should distinguish between two questions. One is, where does money come from in general, and where does money come from today? And I like to kind of start with the today question, because that it is an empirical question, kind of how is money created in a particular society. And today you need to understand that on the one hand, money is created by private banks when they issue credit on the back of loans. So we have kind of given the power to create money to private banks. However, in order to do that, they also need the government, they also need the state. And the way they need the state is for the state to accept bank money in payment of taxes. So the shortest definition of what is money today is money today are the things or entities that you can use to pay your taxes with. That's kind of which is also why, I mean, I agree with you, but I don't think money is gold, because you can't use it to pay your taxes. So in that sense, it's not a generally circulating means of exchange that is supported by the government.
Yes, it is. It's definitely not a way to transact today. Gold. It is the hard asset, the commodity money of the centuries, but definitely you cannot use it to pay the federal government in taxes today. I want to. It's not to say that it's not money, but it is obviously not a modern way of transacting. Similarly to Ray Dalio, who is the biggest hedge fund manager in the world, you talk about the boom and bust cycles. And you explain that banks generally, because of their business models and their need to obviously be profitable, their business model is counterproductive to the needs of society at times. They can overinflate and overdeflate the currency supply and intensify the cycles. Can you explain how banks work, and for investors who are listening to this, how can they capitalize on the way that banks work, or how can they capitalize or safeguard themselves in general from what's happening when banks either choke the currency supply or open the floodgates and lets it wide open?
Well, I don't know. You have to remember I'm an academic, so I'm not sure I can tell you or tell anyone how to profit on this, but I can tell you how. So the power to create money comes with kind of two privileges. One of them is to decide how much money should there be in the economy at a particular time. And the other one is to say, well, when new money is created, where does it enter the economy? In which sectors of the economy do we send it? And so we have to remember that banks they're microeconomic agents. That means that they do not base their decisions on macroeconomic policy considerations. They're not in charge of the economy. That's not their responsibilities. Their responsibilities is to act as companies, so they would base their decisions on what's good for business, and in that they tend to follow the cycles in the economy. So whenever you have prices going up, if you have house prices going up, land prices going up, and even also ordinary growth, they tend to be more eager to borrow money, create new money and borrow it into the economy. And then when we see some sort of deflation, of course, what happens then is that what they do, they exacerbate whatever cycle is already in the economy. So if it's going up, they make it go up even more. But it's also when they've done that, and then a bubble burst and we have a deflation, then we see the opposite reaction. We see them not wanting to borrow new money into the economy, not wanting to send them in there, and then that sort of also exacerbates the deflation. So in that sense, they act pro-cyclically, in that they then exacerbate sort of normal business cycles. Another thing that banks, of course, banks take risks. I mean, that's part of their business models, but they also want to minimize risks, and therefore they are more what they want to. They prefer to borrow money into places where value already exists. So they want to borrow for real estate because it's already there, which from a business perspective is fine. Of course, yes. Then if the person who's taken out the loan, if he can't pay it, you can just take the house. So that from that perspective. However, from a macroeconomic perspective, it means that new money is sent into those sectors of the economy where value already exists and where new value is not created. So when you borrow money into the housing market, maybe you create a little bit more houses, but you don't create more land because, you can't create more land. It's just there. So you just get deflation. Whereas what we would like banks to do more, perhaps, is to borrow into the productive sector of the economy, borrow to entrepreneurs and borrow to creation of new jobs, new value, new idea, that kind of thing. But the way banks function today, they're not really designed for that. So in that sense, we have like a paradox or contradiction where good business decisions in banks lead to bad macroeconomic consequences.
Sure, and obviously when you say borrow, you mean do lending, lend into.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yes.
In Danish, it's the same word, so sometimes I get it confused. So so lend into the economy. Yes,
I completely understand, and obviously the banks would go where the economy is robust. So as you say, if there's a boom in housing, that they would exacerbate and capitulate, lend more to the housing sector than obviously to weak industries. But where the weak industries are, that's where undervalued opportunities are, and that's where entrepreneurs would go. So that's exactly what you're talking about. And in that sense, that is also the problem that you talk about when you talk about inequality. We'll get to that. I want to ask you before that, personally, in your opinion, you're an academic, in the journey that you took through life, and you've been, you're part of Europe, Denmark, etc., the Scandinavian countries. How do you look at the role of gold and silver in modern society? What is the common outlook, and what is your personal outlook on it?
I think the potential for gold is, I think it's sometimes, overrated or overestimated. The thing about a gold standard, on the one hand, I think the idea of having a stable money supply, so you don't have for instance in Denmark between 2003 and 2007, just in the run up to the crisis, we had virtually a doubling of the money supply because banks were lending all this money into the economy. Obviously, we don't want that. We want a stable supply of money. And then sometimes we think we can get that by imposing some sort of gold standard. The problem with the gold standard is that in many ways it's a false security. So you have gold standards until you don't have them anymore. That's what we saw in the 70s. There was a gold standard in the Bretton Woods currency system, and then but exactly at the point where where the gold standard was needed, it wasn't there anymore. So it's like an umbrella which breaks whenever it starts raining. It's kind of it has that flaw, and so therefore I think what we need instead is that first we need central banks that are able to control the money supply, and also central banks that have a governance structure which does not lead them to do all the kinds of weird quantitative easing experiments that we're seeing today. And I'm perfectly aware that there's many flaws in this, and a lot of the people who are into gold and silver, they come from a point of mistrust to the government and the state and the central bank. And I think that mistrust is perfectly legitimate. I completely understand it, and I also share it to a large extent. I think what we're seeing today is not central banks serving the general economy, but central banks serving very particular interests in society. And in that light, you might say, well, do you want to then give more power to these central banks? But I don't. I think it's the what was it that Winston Churchill said about democracy? It's the worst system except for all the others. And that's so. I haven't even explained what that is, but the idea of a sovereign money system, I think, is the worst system except for all the others. So, and in that system, there's no, I mean, gold and silver doesn't really play a role there.
It's a very interesting take. Obviously, this is gonna agitate a lot of people with your opinion, and I love that, because this is the reason that I want to get you on, because academics have different opinions. The sound money advocates, the gold bugs, have other opinions. It is very interesting to think about, to say, look, there was a gold standard, but there's a president that can decide we're off. That's it. We're off the gold standard, and create a 1970s type event. It is important to note that at that time it was illegal to own gold as a citizen in the United States, and therefore you cannot protect yourself from that sort of a decision. It would be interesting to think about whether or not he would have made the same decision had the population already been saving in gold, because that will make things a lot different. I want to ask you, okay, so
let me just finish here. I want to give when I hear people who are into gold and silver, I think I share a lot of their analysis of the economy. I was when I first came across Ron Paul, this was years ago, I still really like him, and I think he makes a lot of really good points. However, I'm not sure that it's going to solve it. So what I will give the gold bugs listening, I think I agree. We need a gold standard. However, I think we need a gold standard without gold. So that's my
What do you mean by that?
I mean, we need a money system that does the same as a money system with a gold standard does, however, without the gold, because I think the gold is a false security. It's just an insurance. You're saying it's a little bit like today we have deposit insurance, right? So if you have money in the bank, you can be sure that up to, in our country, it's €100 or 700,000. That doesn't matter. €100,000. Then the government will, or the central bank will sort of refund that if the bank goes down. And then you can say, oh, okay, fine, nice. Then we have stable banking system. However, what happens the next time there's a crisis? What is our guarantee that the deposit insurance is still there? So there aren't any.
In other words, it gives a false sense of security to the citizenry to take. I completely understand where you're coming from. And of course, it all comes down to the people, right? It all comes down to the people that manage this. If they're aligned with the interests of the public, then they will not abuse the power that they have. So I think that's where you're getting at. Gold is when you give gold to the government or to the central bank, and you tell the central bank or the government, here is a pile of gold that will securitize our currency system. Do not abuse it. And they go ahead and abuse it, then we are living under a false sense of security, which is all the more reason to have some gold, as a private citizen.
So what I will say, and maybe that leads into perhaps your next question, is I think we don't need the false security. We need a proper governance structure in the central bank, and also with regards to the relationship between the central bank and the government. And at the same time, I would also like to see more monetary plurality, in the sense that we have multiple money systems in the economy. So we will have a government money system. And then I'm all for cryptocurrencies. Then we can have cryptocurrencies. Then we can have local currencies. Then we can have all kinds of other things. Because I also think that's also a way of sort of balancing. And I think that's happening already. I think that's one of the good things that's happened that Bitcoin has brought, is that it's forcing the central banks to kind of, and also the regular banks to kind of say, ooh, maybe our monopoly and our current business model, maybe it's not going to last forever. And so maybe we need to shape it up. So there is already some sort of sense of competition. And I can see that in the debate around central bank digital currency, which I'm in favor. It's the emergence of Bitcoin has actually pushed that agenda, which I think is a really, really good thing. And it's a sign of what this monetary plurality, it sort of creates a healthy form of competition between different types of money systems.
Interesting. I'm all for competition, of course, and I love that idea. I think it's very interesting to listen to your point of views. It's all based on trust. It is all based on the trust level in the establishment, whether or not you think we need more gold, no gold, etc., or any other security. It's definitely it comes down to how much trust do you have that people that lead our institutions would behave in the right way, and that.
I want to add one thing to that, because I agree, yes, there's elements of trust in the monetary system.
Sure.
But there's also another very important thing, which has to do with power and force and even violence. So in order to have a money system that works, it's not enough that people have trust, but if they also kind of fear the government, or they know, well, if push comes to shove, the government is going to use violence, if they have to, military violence, to defend this monetary system, then we trust. I think that's part of what's sustaining the US dollar as the sort of world currency, is that we have I don't know if you call that trust, but we have a belief that the US government is going to go to great lengths to defend this sort of, I don't know if we can call it a hegemony, but at least this sort of privileged position. So there's a very tight connection between money and military power or state power.
Sure. And obviously this goes back hundreds of years, where the idea that the government should instill some sort of a fear in the citizenry, otherwise there will be anarchy. Ole, I want to ask you, I love this discussion. It goes from philosophical to practical and back, and it's very interesting. In light of that, let me ask you something that is a philosophical question. Is debt part of human nature then? Can we run an economy without credit, without debt? Because it looks like what you're saying in our framework, growth is based on some sort of a credit between institutions, between businesses, between the government and institutions. What is your overall idea and notion about debt? And do you think we are in a dangerous debt bubble?
So the answer to the last question is very easy. Yes, we are in a very dangerous debt bubble. So can we have an economy without debt and credit? No, we can't, and we shouldn't. I mean, I think credit comes from Latin, means credare, which means belief. So it means that believing in something. And I think you can even see, I mean, just any human relation, like my relationship to my wife, for instance, we have sort of a sense of mutual debt. So I have the sense that I owe her something. She also has a sense that she owes me something. And when you have a child, you also have a sense that, oh, I've been given this child. I owe this something to this child. And hopefully the child will grow up and think, oh, I've received so much from my parents. I owe that to my children. So I think this whole notion of debt it is part of human nature. And I think that's also, so the economy is just a more, it's just another version of, or it's a monetized version of those human relations. And there's nothing wrong with debt as such. I think that's a good thing. It's also something that ties people and institutions together. So debt and credit is fine. What isn't fine is if there's too much of it. And that goes, that it's the same in human relations. if there's too much debt, too much sense of guilt, like, oh, how can I ever repay my wife for all that? Oh, and if there's an imbalance there, that's not a healthy relationship. Obviously, there shouldn't be too much. There should be some, but not too much. Sense of obligation, but not too much guilt. I can't sleep and stuff. And it's the same in the economy. Today we have way too much debt. Way too much debt, and it's like it's an overhang on the economy. It's sort of dampening the productive forces or the entrepreneurial forces in the economy. It's preventing the economy and the society from developing as well as it could. One of my favorite economists is Michael Hudson, and he says debts that can't be repaid won't be repaid. The question is how. There's a lot of philosophy in that little sentence. And I think that's the situation we have today. I mean, I don't think anyone believes that the debt, all of the debt we have today can be repaid. I don't even think that many people think that we can even move move sort of naturally to a lower level of debt. So I think one of the things we're not going to get around in terms of developing, I think it's going to happen, is some sort of debt write-off. There's no way around that. You just have to do that. And that goes in many, for instance, in the Eurozone, the relationship between Italy and Germany, there's no way of settling that balance without some sort of a debt write-off. And again, I mean, it's also what you see in religions, like in Christianity, is there's this idea that if guilt builds up too much, people are gonna get unhappy and no. So what we've built into Christianity is a mechanism for debt redemption, which is forgiveness. So, I did this wrong. Yeah, that was wrong, but I forgive you. Okay, now we can move on. And so this is also an old knowledge that you need to forget. It's the same in relationships with your wife or something. You also, if you can't forgive each other, it doesn't work. So, and it's the same in the economy. We need, Germany has to forgive the Italians one way or the other. And if they don't do that, it's just going to happen anyway. There's just going to be a war or something else which will sort of force this debt forgiveness.
It will either be a peaceful resolution via some sort of a write-off where there are victims and there are unjust victors, or there will be a more violent way of doing it, either by overinflating it or otherwise. I want to ask you, Ole, because it's very important for me to get to this subject. The solution. So let's talk about, we have concentration of power right now. We have instability. We have inequality. We have major issues with how the world's economy is operating. One question I have for you is, why isn't there more revolt for this? Many people complain about it, but they go on living decades in this system, thinking, man, this is not fair. And I'm not talking about the wealthy people. The wealthy people, they you don't, not necessarily billionaires, but people that have they have good businesses, etc. I understand why they do not carry the torch, because they've benefited from the existing system and they're having a good life. The people that are poor, the people that know that this system is designed with some falsehood regarding how they can participate in the economy. Why do they, at least in your regions, in Denmark, in Scandinavia, in Europe in general, why do not more people take up like what we saw in France right now, or in Italy? But in general, why is it there's not enough force to change these democracies differently? I know you talk about in your TEDx talk about democratizing money, and people that should understand that they have a vote here that they can change. I'll give you the floor because I know you have. It looks like you want to get something off your chest.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's and there's not a simple answer. I think there's multiple factors. I think one sort of on an existential level, and we can also think about this in personal relations. What debt or sort of what guilt tends to do is that it's an individual experience. When I feel guilty, it's also when I feel the most sort of alone in a sense. I don't feel that I share guilt. In a way, guilt can't be shared with others. It's your business, and you have to deal with it with God or your wife or whatever it is. So there's it individualizes you. And I think that's also what the economy does, is that when you are in debt, you kind of tend to think, oh, that's also me, I'm bad, and I need to figure this. I can't burden other people with this. That's what you're seeing in the agricultural sector, for instance, in Denmark, that it's overburdened with debt. And it's obvious that it's a structural, systematic problem. And yet the individual farmers are like, oh yeah, it's me, and maybe I'm not a good farmer, all this. So I think that's one of the explanations for why it's difficult to mobilize people around debt. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that the way the system, this as with anything in the economy, there's winners and there's losers, but then there's also a group of people who think they're winners, and yet they may be losers. And one of the things that this money system does is that it overinflates values. So, for instance, houses, it overinflates houses. So what's happened in Denmark is that even though we have more debt than we've ever had, we also have higher house prices than we've ever had. So there's a general sense of wealth. And that here, at least, I think that's part of the explanation for why people do not revolt, because they kind of have a sense that, well, we are wealthy. There's no problems. And then a third thing is also, it's not quite obvious to people who they should revolt against. For instance, for me, like one of the major or the primary or important institute is the central bank. But to the ordinary, going to a demonstration in front of the central bank is weird, because people don't think of this as even a political institution. And that's also not how central banks present themselves. In that sense, they don't invite protest. We will here in Copenhagen, the central bank is actually just opposite of the parliament. And there's plenty of demonstrations in front of parliament, but I've never seen one demonstration in front of the central bank. So you would just need people to just turn around and look the other way. But it would be weird because, but they're just technocrats, and and that's also how they present themselves. So that's a third, is that it's not quite clear. And also another thing that's not quite clear is that relationship, what part do the banks play and what part does the central bank play? That's also very unclear. So it's very clear where to direct your protest. Having said that, I will say that that's one of the really good things that's come out of the financial crisis is, I think, the general awareness of these problems among people is rising at least as rapidly as house prices and debt, maybe even more. In that sense, I'm optimistic, and I think the quality of the general discussion about economic and these kind is, I think that's increased.
Definitely.
To my mind, I really think
definitely around the world.
Yes,
without a doubt.
So I think the next time we have a crisis, if we can recognize it as a crisis, but the next time we have a crisis, I think what happened with the last crisis is that it was just sort of tapered over with duct tape, and then let's lower interest rates and let's do some quantitative easing and then just move on as if nothing's happened. But the next time there's a crisis, I don't think that's going to happen. The danger is, of course, that the next crisis we will not recognize it as a crisis. We will say it's something else. It's a war, or it's whatever it could be. we won't recognize that it's got anything to do with money, and also therefore we won't see that the solution has to do with money. I think that's the danger.
Oh, that's very interesting. And while you were talking about, I was thinking a lot about um, how would how would the gold standard would have been different if there would have been accountability on Richard Nixon or or the United States government, if there was international laws in place where they cannot default on the standards, or many other things that have to do with personal accountability. Warren Buffett talked
But
a lot
again,
about.
yeah,
Yes,
I know, I know, but still, well, even if there had been international laws, who would have to enforce those laws?
it's very true.
I
These
mean,
are very
yes, Nixon, he had the gold, but he also had the guns. So it's, I mean, yeah,
it's a very philosophical and complex question. Also, Warren Buffett talked a lot about making sure that the bank CEOs have their salaries and their bonuses and their wife's assets and everything that has to do with liabilities tied to their performance. In other words, if they really mismanage the company, that they can, their wealth is at stake, because a lot of what happened in 2008, the same people did not get, they didn't even get penalized in terms of their wealth. I'm not talking about whether or not it was criminal behavior, but I am
yeah.
talking about whether or not the fact that millions of people suffered and they didn't suffer personally. We can go on and on about this.
I just want to add here, unless then the financial sector starts bribing them in Bitcoin, then we can't do anything anyway.
Ole, first of
Yeah.
all, I know you published several other things. Where can people access more of your opinions and what you do, all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff?
So that I've written several books. I've written this book, called Making Money. It came out in 2014 or 15. So you can read that, which it's been, I was very happy about that. It was translated into Russian. So anyone from Russia, they can buy this book, and it's in the process of being translated into Spanish as well. Then I wrote this book, not a very good title. I regretted it. It doesn't, Parallax of Growth. You can see it's like, but anyway, it's a good book. I wrote it, but I had fun writing it. So that's always a good sign if you write a book. So Parallax of Growth, you can also read that. It's about the relationship between the economy and money and nature. And then my old book, this one, Poker, the Parody of Capitalism. If anyone's into poker, that's also it was also fun to write. And then other than that, where can you, I have some, if you're interested in central bank digital currency, which has sort of been my most recent field of research, there's some working papers. There's one called Designing New Money. You can just Google that, Designing New Money, and then my name, and then it will pop up. You can just immediately download it. And there you can read about central bank digital currencies. I guess that's kind of,
Ole, thank you very much for taking the time today, and it was really
fun. It was really a pleasure. Yeah, I'd be happy to come back on your channel.
We will definitely have you back and circle back with us in a few months as this year develops. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks.